Ruth Kesler typed other men's letters for 4 years. And the whole time, the answer to the thing that could sink the plant sat inside her father's worn green book, on her own kitchen table. The morning the whole quarter froze on a rail siding, not one man in the front office thought to ask the typist. She did not raise her voice. She sharpened her father's stub pencil, and she waited. Royce Deemer, the traffic manager, stood in front of 8 executives and said it plain. "This is a railroad matter, Miss Kesler. Bring the coffee and let the men who understand freight handle it. 40 boxcars. $312,000. 9 days on the clock. 600 jobs riding on it." What none of them knew, not Deemer, not old Walter Ostrander, not his son David, was that the railroad had no right to hold those cars at all. Ruth's father had proved it once. Back in 1954. They called him a troublemaker, and they showed him the door. If you've ever held the one answer nobody in the room would let you speak, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something for me. Tap subscribe and stay to the end, because this one earns it. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I like to know who's out there. Now let me take you back. Halloway, Ohio, the autumn of 1961. It was a small town the way a lot of towns were small then. One main street, a 5 and dime with a bell over the door, a diner where the coffee was a nickel and the pie was cut too generous to make a profit. The maples along Sycamore went red first, then the color ran down the whole street like somebody had spilled it. In the mornings the fog sat low over the creek behind the machine works, and by 9 it burned off, and the sun came through gold. The machine works was the heart of the place. Ostrander Machine Works. It had been there since before the First War, and half the county drew a paycheck from it, one way or another. They made gear housings. They made valve bodies and castings, heavy gray iron poured and machined and crated, and every quarter the finished goods rolled out on the rail spur that ran along the north wall of the plant. That fall the whole quarter rode on one order. 40 boxcars of finished castings bound for Continental Tractor down in Kentucky. Gear housings, mostly, the kind of thing a tractor can't turn a wheel without. Ruth Kesler worked in the front office. She was 24. She had dark brown hair she wore parted in the center and pinned in a low twist, and green eyes and a mouth that most people read as quiet before they read it as anything else. She typed, she filed. She carried the coffee when there were meetings, because that was one of the things the girl in the front office did, and she never made a fuss about it. She wore the same 2 dresses turned and pressed. She was not a woman anyone in that building looked at twice. That was the thing about Ruth. People looked past her. And she had learned, a long time ago, to let them. Here is what none of them knew. At night, in the kitchen of the little rented house on Depot Street, Ruth Kesler read freight tariffs the way other people read scripture. She read the official classification. She read the demurrage rules and the reconsignment rules and the fine gray print about liens and misroutings and the exact weight brackets that decided whether a load shipped at one rate or another. She knew it cold. There was not another soul in Halloway County who could open the classification to any page and tell you what it meant, and mean it. She learned it from her father. Frank Kesler had run the shipping desk at the works for 19 years. He started as a boy sweeping the platform, and he ended keeping the freight books, and in between he taught himself every line of the tariff because nobody else would. Ruth used to sit on a stool at the shipping desk after school. She'd swing her feet and he'd hand her the big green book, the classification, bound in green cloth gone soft at the corners, and he'd say, "Read past the first line, Ruthie. Anybody can read the first line. The money's always further down." He wrote in the margins in pencil. Little notes. Dates, a word here and there. Corrections, mostly, where he'd caught the railroad billing the plant wrong. And there were more of those than you'd think. They let Frank go in 1954. Ruth was 17. Nobody said exactly why, and Frank never explained it, and he was not the same man after. He kept the green book on the shelf by the door until the day he died, 3 winters back, and then it was Ruth's. So she kept reading it. That was all. It was the last of him she had. And she did something with it that nobody asked her to do, and nobody ever thanked her for. Every month, when the freight bills came into the front office, Ruth took a copy home. Quietly, she checked them against the tariff at her kitchen table, line by line, and when the railroad had overbilled the plant, small amounts, most every month, she made a neat note. And she corrected the entry before it went to the accounting man. She never signed the note. She left it typed and clean on his desk, unsigned, and he assumed one of the men had caught it. She saved the works a little money that way, month after month, for 4 years. Nobody knew. She didn't want them to. You have to understand her to understand the rest of this. Ruth Kesler believed, deep down where she didn't say it out loud, that staying invisible was the same as staying safe. Her father had put his name on things. Her father had spoken up. And they had shown him the door for it, and it had broken him. So Ruth kept her head down. She did the work. She let the men take the credit. And she told herself that was wisdom. It wasn't wisdom, but it kept her warm, the way a thin coat keeps you warm. You don't know how thin it is until the weather turns. The weather turned on a Tuesday. She knew something was wrong before she was through the door, because the front office was too loud. There were voices coming from Mr. Deemer's glass office at the end of the hall, and they weren't happy voices. She hung her coat. She sat at her desk. She rolled a sheet into the typewriter, and she listened the way she always listened, which was to say, completely, while looking like she wasn't. The shipment was stuck. That was the word going around. Stuck. The 40 cars had gone out on Friday, rolled north to the interchange at Ashby Junction, where the plant's little spur met the main line of the Ohio Central and Western. And there they had stopped. The OC&W had refused to move them onto the through route. The railroad said the load was classed wrong. Misclassified, they said the castings had been billed under the wrong item in the classification, at the wrong rate, and until it was corrected and the difference paid, the cars weren't going anywhere. And they'd slapped a lien on the freight to make sure of it. Ruth's hands went still on the keys. Misclassified, she knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach before your head catches up, that it was wrong. Not the shipment, the railroad. But she said nothing. She typed a letter about a valve order, and she carried a message down the hall, and she kept her face smooth, and inside she was already turning the pages of the green book in her mind. By noon they had the numbers, and the numbers were bad. 40 cars, held at the junction. Demurrage. That's the charge the railroad puts on you for every day their car sits loaded and not moving, running at $58 a car per day. 8 times 40. More than $2,000 a day, bleeding out while nobody moved. And worse than the money going out was the money not coming in, because the Continental Tractor contract had a clause in it. And the clause was plain. Delivery had to be made within a set window, or the order voided. Continental could walk. They could buy their housing somewhere else, and the works would eat the whole quarter's production, sitting in gray iron on a siding 40 miles away. 9 days. That was what the clause left them. 9 days to get those cars unstuck and rolling south, or the largest order Ostrander Machine Works had booked in 5 years turned to nothing. And behind that order stood the payroll. 600 names. Ruth typed the checks. She knew every one. $312,000. The quarter. The plant, sitting still, on a rail siding, in the cold. That night she walked home the long way, past the depot, the way she did when she needed to think. A train went through southbound, and she watched it, the whole heavy length of it, the couplers banging one after another down the line, and she thought about her father. Frank used to time the through freights with his pocket watch. He knew them all by the sound. At the kitchen table, she made her supper, and she did not eat much of it. She got the green book down off the shelf by the door. She turned the lamp up. And she found the section, she knew right where it was, and she read the item that governed machined iron castings, and she read it twice, and then she sat back in the chair. They had it backwards. The railroad had classed the load under one item, at the high rate, and claimed the plant had shipped it under the low. But the load wasn't either of those things, not really. Read past the first line, and there was a third item, further down, the one that actually fit finished machined castings crated for delivery, and under that item the whole hold fell apart. There was no misclassification. There was no ground for the lien. The OC&W had no right to keep those cars sitting at Ashby Junction. Not one day. Not 1 hour. She said it out loud, alone, in the kitchen, in a voice barely above the hiss of the lamp. Daddy always said the railroad had the classification backwards, but nobody upstairs would ever read past the first line. She set the book aside. She did not, that night, dream it mattered. What could she do with it? She was the girl who carried the coffee. You didn't walk into Royce Deemer's office and tell him he had the freight law wrong. Men had lost more than a job for less than that. Her father had. So she washed her cup, and she turned down the lamp, and she went to bed. And the book sat on the table in the dark, with her father's pencil notes crowding the margins, and 40 miles away 40 cars sat in the cold, and the meter ran. Downtown, in the front office, they had a different plan. They had college men. Deemer had brought in 2 young fellows David Ostrander had hired out of the state university that summer. Bright boys with slide rules and pressed collars and business degrees, and Deemer put them on it. Find the error. Prove the plant classed it right, or find where it classed it wrong, and fix it. They set up in the conference room, with the freight bills spread out and the phone book of a tariff open in front of them, and they went at it. They burned 3 days. Ruth watched it from her desk. She watched them carry coffee, her coffee, that she made, into that room and come out looking grayer each afternoon. She heard the pieces of it through the glass. They were reading the first line. They were arguing about which of the 2 items the railroad had named was correct, the high one or the higher one, when the answer was neither. When the answer was a page further down that not one of them had turned to. She could have told them in 10 minutes. She did not. She was not asked, and she had spent 4 years learning not to speak until she was asked, and being asked never came. On the 3rd day, David Ostrander came out of that room and stood in the hall and rubbed the back of his neck, and Ruth, glancing up, saw a young man who was scared. He was 28, the owner's son. College-trained, being groomed to run the works one day, and by all accounts a decent man, which in that family was not nothing. He had his father's jaw, and none of his father's coldness, at least not yet. He believed the answer to a freight problem had to come from a man with a degree in freight, because that was how he'd been raised to think, that worth had a diploma attached to it and arrived through the front door. He did not, that afternoon, so much as glance at the girl at the typewriter. But the plant was drowning, and Walter Ostrander was not a patient man, and on the 4th morning the old man called a meeting. The full front office. 8 men: Deemer, David, the accounting man, the 2 college boys, the plant superintendent, the sales manager, and Walter himself at the head of the table, with his face like a closed drawer. And they needed coffee. So they rang for Ruth. She heard the bell. She knew what it meant. She fixed the tray the way she always fixed it, the cups and the cream and the sugar in the little bowl. And she carried it down the hall, and she went in. The room was thick, with cigarette smoke, and the particular quiet of men who are losing and won't say so. The freight bills were spread all down the long table. Walter sat at the head. Deemer stood at the mapboard with a pointer, mid-sentence, and he did not stop for her. She set the tray on the sideboard. She began to pour. And she made her mistake, if it was a mistake. She looked at the bills. They were right there, the top copy facing her as she set a cup at David's elbow, and her eye went down the item numbers the way her eye always went, and she saw it. The whole argument on the table, 4 days of it, aimed at the wrong 2 lines. And something in her, some thin thread of her father, pulled tight and would not let her pour the next cup. She straightened. She held the pot. And in a voice that was quiet but that carried, because the room had gone quiet around it, she said, "It's classed wrong." But not the way the railroad says. The load isn't either of those items. There's a third one, further down, and under that one, they've got no right to hold the cars at all. You could hear the clock on the wall. David turned and looked at her. Really looked, maybe for the first time. One of the college boys half rose out of his chair, his mouth open. Walter Ostrander's eyes moved to her slowly, the way a man's eyes move to a thing that has spoken out of turn. And Royce Deemer laughed. It was not a big laugh. That was the cruelty of it. It was small and easy, a laugh with all the room's authority behind it, and he set his pointer down on the mapboard, and he turned to her, and he said it kindly, which was worse than if he'd shouted. "Miss Kesler." He let her name sit there. "This is a railroad matter. It's been a railroad matter for 30 years, which is about how long I've been doing it. Now," he nodded at the tray, "bring the coffee, and let the men who understand freight handle it. There's a good girl." There was a sound around the table. Not quite laughter. The soft, shifting sound 8 men make when they have decided together, in an instant, without a word, that a thing is settled and a person has been put back in her place. One of the college boys smiled down at his papers. The sales manager looked at the ceiling. Even David, and this is the part that mattered later, even David dropped his eyes to the bills. Because he was decent, but he was not yet brave, and it is a long way from decent to brave. And he had not made the trip. Ruth Kesler stood very still. She did not argue. She did not flush. She did not let one thing show on her face, and if you had been in that room you would have thought the words had rolled off her like rain off a hat. She poured the last 2 cups steady, not a rattle in the pot, and she set the pot on the tray, and she gathered the used cups, and she walked out with her chin level and her eyes dry. She was 3 steps down the hall before her hands started to shake, and she did not let them shake until the door had closed. That is where I have to stop and tell you something, because if you have lived at all, you already know it. There is a particular kind of hurt that comes from being right in a room that has decided you can't be. It isn't the being wrong that stings. Being wrong you can fix. It's being right, and holding the proof of it in your 2 hands, and watching the whole room agree, pleasantly, without malice, the way they'd agree the sky is up, that you are not the kind of person from whom the answer is allowed to come. That hurt has a long half-life. Ruth carried hers back to her desk and set it down next to the typewriter and rolled a fresh sheet into the platen and began, with steady fingers, to type the sales manager's correspondence. But something had happened in that room, and it had happened to more than Ruth. David Ostrander had heard her. Oh, he'd dropped his eyes. He'd let it pass. He'd sat there in the smoke and let Deemer put the typist back in her place, and he had hated himself a little for it, even as he did it. But he'd heard her. A third item. Further down. No right to hold the cars. The words wouldn't leave him. He sat through the rest of that useless meeting, and he watched Deemer point at the map and promise the old man results, and all David could think about was the quiet voice at his elbow, saying the one thing 4 days of degreed men had not said. That evening he did not go home when the whistle blew. He told his father he had paperwork. He waited until the office emptied, until the typewriters went quiet and the coats came off the hooks and the front door swung and latched, until it was just the hum of the one light left burning over the file room at the back. And then he went and found her. She was still there. Of course she was still there. Ruth Kesler was the first one in and the last one out, and that night she'd stayed late on purpose, because the house on Depot Street was too quiet to think in, and the file room, for all its dust, was the one place in Halloway that had ever felt like hers. She was standing at an open drawer with a stack of freight copies in her hand when she heard the door and looked up and saw the owner's son standing there in his shirt sleeves, his tie pulled loose, looking like a man who had walked a long way to say something and wasn't sure how. "Miss Kesler." "Mr. Ostrander." She set the copies down. "Is there something you need typed?" "It's late." "No." He came in a step. He looked at the drawer, the files, the little world of paper she kept. "This afternoon. In the meeting. What you said." She waited. She had learned to wait. "Deemer says you read a book." He said it carefully, watching her. "He's telling my father you got hold of some tariff and got yourself confused. That it was, his word, cute, but that it doesn't hold, that the railroad knows its own classification. Is that what you think?" And David Ostrander, to his lasting credit, was quiet a moment, and then he said the truest thing he had ever said in that building. "I think 4 men with degrees have had 4 days. And we're no closer, and the one person who said anything that sounded like an answer is the person we told to bring the coffee." He looked at her. "So no, I don't know what I think. That's why I'm here. I'm asking. Show me." Ruth Kesler looked at the owner's son for a long moment. And here was the thing she had to decide, standing in that file room with the one light burning. She had spent 4 years learning not to put her name on anything. She had watched what it cost her father to be the man who spoke up. Every instinct she had, every thin coat instinct that kept her safe, told her to say it was nothing. To say Mr. Deemer surely knew best. To pour the coffee and file the copies and disappear back into the wallpaper where it was warm. But he had asked. In 4 years, no one had asked. And there is something in being asked, honestly, by someone willing to be shown. That is very hard for a proud and lonely person to turn away. "Wait here," she said. She had it in her bag. She'd brought it that morning, though she'd told herself she didn't know why. She took out the green book, the cloth soft at the corners, her father's book, and she set it on the flat top of the file cabinet under the light, and she opened it to the page she'd read twice the night before. And she turned it so he could see. "My father kept this," she said. "Frank Kesler. He ran the shipping desk here for 19 years, before your father's time in the front office. He taught himself the whole classification, because nobody else at this plant would, and the railroad billed us wrong for years because of it, and he caught them. Every month, he caught them." Her finger came down on the page. "Here, this is the item the railroad's claiming, and this one, the one they say we should have used. They're arguing over these two. But finished machined castings, crated for delivery, don't fall under either. They fall here." She moved her finger down the page, 3 lines to a paragraph in smaller print, and beside it, in the margin, in soft pencil gone gray with age, was her father's hand. A date, 1954, and 2 words. Ruth had read them 100 times. "They're wrong." David leaned in over the book. His shoulder came near hers. He read the item, and he read the pencil note, and she watched his face change the way a man's face changes when a thing that has been dark for days goes suddenly clear. 1954, he said. He caught this before. Her voice was very quiet now. The same railroad, the same mistake. He found it, and he wrote it down, and... She stopped. She had never said the next part out loud to anyone. And that was the year they let him go. Mr. Ostrander, whatever they told your father the reason was, that was the year. David looked up from the book. He looked at her, and something moved behind his eyes, something that was doing arithmetic he didn't like the sum of. "Show me the rest," he said. "The whole thing." Slow, so she showed him. She turned the pages and she walked him through it the way her father had walked her through it on the stool at the shipping desk. And she did not talk down to him, and she did not dress it up, she just laid it out, line by line, the way it was. The item. The rate. The rule that said a lien couldn't stand where the classification the railroad itself had used didn't fit the goods. The reconsignment procedure, how, if a load was held wrong at an interchange, a shipper could file to correct the class and order the cars moved on. Over the local agent's head, straight to the railroad's own tariff, and the railroad had to honor it because it was their own book saying so. They were bent over that green book, under the one light, for the better part of an hour. And somewhere in that hour the file room stopped being a file room and became just the two of them, and a lamp, and her father's pencil. At one point she reached to turn back a page to show him something, and his hand was already there on the ledger. And his hand came down over hers, just for a second, just the warm weight of it over her knuckles, as they both reached for the same corner of the same page. Neither of them said anything about it. She drew her hand back. He cleared his throat, but it had happened. And they both knew it had happened, and the air in that little room was different after, charged the way the air gets before a summer storm, when nothing has fallen yet, but everything is about to. "Why hasn't anyone here ever known you could do this?" David said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because nobody ever asked," Ruth said simply. "You don't ask the girl who brings the coffee." He was quiet. "Mr. Ostrander," she closed the book, gently, her hand flat on the green cloth. "This frees the cars. I'm nearly sure of it. If someone files the correction and the reconsignment, the OC&W has to move that shipment. There's no lien. There never was. But," and here her steadiness cracked, just a hair, just enough for him to see the fear under it, but it goes over Mr. Deemer's head. "It says, in writing, that the man who's run this plant's freight for 30 years has had it wrong for a week while the cars bled money. And it says my father was right, and that means somebody in this building was wrong to fire him. There are men who will not thank you for that. Mr. Deemer chief among them." She looked at the book, not at David. "I've kept my head down a long time. I know what it costs to lift it." David Ostrander stood up straight in the file room and looked at the girl and the book, and for the first time in his groomed and careful life he saw plainly that the answer he needed had come. Not through the front door, not with a diploma, but from the last place he'd ever been taught to look, and that everything he'd been told about where worth comes from was a story that some men told to keep other people carrying coffee. "Then we lift it," he said. "Together. First thing tomorrow. I'll take it to my father. And I'll know." She surprised them both. It came out of her before she'd chosen it. "Not to your father. Not through the front office." She pressed her hand flat on the green book. Her heart was going hard. "You take this to Walter Ostrander tomorrow, and it becomes a memo, and it becomes a meeting, and Deemer gets a day to explain it away, and he's good at explaining. He's had 30 years of practice. And your father, forgive me, your father will not put his quarter in the hands of a filing correction his son heard from a typist in a back room after hours. He'll want to be sure. He'll want a man to check it, and every day we lose to being sure is $58 a car, and 9 days is already. She stopped. She made herself breathe. There isn't time to do it the safe way. There's only time to do it the right way, and I don't think those are the same thing anymore. David stared at her. Then what are you saying? Ruth Kesler looked down at her father's book, at the soft green cloth, at the pencil in the margin. 1954. They're wrong. She thought about the coffee she had poured that afternoon with steady hands. She thought about the sound 8 men make when they've put you in your place. She thought about her father coming home in the winter of '54 and setting this book on the shelf by the door and not being the same man after, and how she had learned from watching him that the safest thing in the world is to never once let them see your name. She was so tired of being safe. "There's a man at the junction," she heard herself say. "Sam Bly. A switchman. He knew my father. He could get me onto the yard before the day agent comes on." She wasn't looking at David now. She was looking at some place past him, at a thing she could see coming and could not stop wanting. The reconsignment can be filed at the interchange, at the freight office, first thing, before Deemer's even at his desk. Filed and stamped and moving before anyone in that front office knows it's been done. Her hand closed on the book. If it's already done, there's nothing to explain away. There's only cars, rolling south. Ruth, it was the first time he'd used her name. He didn't seem to notice he'd done it. Whoever files that puts their name on it. Over Deemer. Without authority. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong. She looked at him then, and her eyes were dry and very clear. "That's the whole trouble, Mr. Ostrander. I have never once been wrong about this book. I just was never allowed to be right where it counted." The light hummed over them. Outside, far off, a train went through the dark toward Ashby Junction, the couplers banging one after another down the line, the way they had the night before, the way they would in the morning. David Ostrander opened his mouth to talk her out of it, to say they'd find another way, a proper way, a way that didn't put a 24-year-old clerk's daughter's name over the head of the most powerful man in the plant and stake her whole quiet, safe life on 3 lines of small print in a dead man's book. He didn't get the chance. Because Ruth was already reaching for her coat, and already, in her mind, she was counting the hours until first light, how early Sam went on at the yard, how long the walk was from the last bus stop, whether the freight office would be open before the day agent came on, and whether her hands would be steady enough to sign her own name at the bottom of the page. Her own name. The one thing she had spent 4 years refusing to put on anything. She pulled the green book against her chest, her father's book, and she looked at the owner's son, and the fear was still there in her. Plain, but under it now was something she hadn't let herself feel since she was 17 and swinging her feet on a stool at the shipping desk. Something that was almost like being awake. "Go home, Mr. Ostrander," she said quietly. "And don't tell your father you were here." She turned off the light. And in the dark of the file room, with 40 cars frozen 40 miles away, and the meter running $58 a car, and the clock down to 8 days now. 8. Ruth Kesler made up her mind to do the one thing she had promised herself she would never do. She was going to sign her name. The bus let her off at the county road, while the sky was still the color of a nickel. Ruth walked the last mile in the dark with the green book buttoned under her coat, and the frost came up through her shoe soles, and she counted her breaths to keep her hands from shaking. Sam Bly was waiting at the switch shanty with a lantern turned low. "You're early," he said. "Earlier than the day agent, anyway. That's the whole trick of it. Can you get me in the freight office? I got a key. I ain't supposed to." He looked at her a long moment. His face was young and honest, and it hurt him to look at her, though she never once saw it. "Your daddy used to come through here. Did you know that? 19 years he came through here. He'd sit on that bench and eat a sandwich and tell me I was classing the coal wrong." Sam smiled a little. He was right, too. He usually was. That's what got him, wasn't it? Ruth didn't answer. She followed the lantern across the frozen cinders, past the long dark wall of the boxcars. 40 of them. She could see the reporting marks stenciled white on the sides, O, C, and W, and the red bad order tags fluttering where the railroad had chalked them held. $312,000 of finished castings sitting still in the cold. Bleeding $58 a car every day the sun came up on them. She stopped and put her gloved hand flat against the steel of the nearest car. "All right," she said. "Let's open the office." The freight office smelled of cold coal stove and carbon paper. Sam lit the lamp. Ruth laid the green book on the counter and turned to the page she could have found blind. The page with her father's stub pencil note in the margin, the words pressed so hard into the paper you could read them with your fingertips. 1954. They're wrong. She filled out the reconsignment order in a clean, upright hand. She wrote out the classification correction beside it, citing the third item, the one that governed finished machined castings, the one no traffic man in the county had ever bothered to read past. Her writing was small, and it did not waver, though inside her everything was going very fast. Then she came to the line at the bottom. For 4 years she had signed nothing. She had typed 1,000 letters and put other men's names under them. She had checked the plant's freight bills at her own kitchen table, at night, unpaid, and never once put her mark on the correction. Staying invisible was the same as staying safe. Her father had signed his name to the truth, and they had shown him the door for it. Ruth looked at the empty line. "You don't have to," Sam said quietly. "You could put the plant's name, Deemer's name, anybody's." "No," she heard her own voice come out steady, and it surprised her. "If it's wrong, they'll want to know whose it is. I won't hand them a stranger to blame." She set the pencil down and picked up the office pen. "It's mine. Let it have my name on it." She signed. Ruth Kesler. Plain as that. The nib scratched once, and it was done, and the thing she had promised herself she would never do was done, and the strangest part was that the sky did not fall. The lamp only hummed. Outside a signal changed from red to green with a soft clack, and far down the line the first car of the string took the pull of the engine and moved. She heard the slack run out, coupler to coupler, 40 of them, banging one after another down toward the interchange the way she had heard them bang in the dark from her bed. Only now they were rolling because she had signed a page. Sam took off his cap. "There they go," he said. "Frank's cars." "Daddy's cars," Ruth said, and for the first time in 4 years, standing in a cold freight office at Ashby Junction with the light coming gray at the window, she let herself cry. Just a little. And then she wiped her face and buttoned the book back under her coat and said, "I have to catch the 7 o'clock bus. I'm due at my desk at 8. She typed letters all morning as if nothing had happened. By 10 o'clock the plant knew. She heard it move through the building the way heat moves, from the yard up through the shipping floor and up the stairs to the front office. The Continental cars had been released overnight. Somebody had filed a reconsignment at the junction. Nobody upstairs had ordered it. Nobody upstairs knew whose name was on it. Not yet. Royce Deemer found out at 10:30, and Ruth heard him before she saw him. He came down the corridor from the traffic office with a wire flimsy crushed in his fist, and his face had gone a bad gray white, and he did not look like a man who had just had his freight freed. He looked like a man who had just heard a door open that he had nailed shut a long time ago. He stopped at her desk. The typing floor went quiet around them. "You," he said. "You did this." "Yes, Mr. Deemer, you have no authority. You're a typist. You forged a shipping instruction over the head of this company's traffic department." His voice was climbing. "I'll have it voided before noon. I'll wire the railroad and have the whole thing thrown out as unauthorized, and I'll have you out of this building on your ear. Do you understand me, girl?" "You can try to void it," Ruth said. She did not stand up, and she did not raise her voice. "But you'd be wiring the railroad to keep holding 40 cars it has no legal right to hold." And when the interstate commerce people asked them why they held brass and iron castings under a lien that only attaches to raw commodity, the way it's written in the third item of the classification, the one your department never read, the railroad is going to answer that a plant traffic manager insisted on it. In writing. Over his own signature. Deemer's mouth worked. Nothing came out. "The order's good," Ruth said. "I checked it 3 times. It'll stand up because it's right. Voiding it won't hurt me, Mr. Deemer. It'll hurt you." He stood there with the wire crumpling in his hand, and for 1 second she watched him understand that she was correct, and watched him hate her for it, and then he turned and went back up the corridor without another word. And he did not send the wire. David Ostrander was standing in the doorway of his father's office. He had heard the whole thing. He looked at Ruth across the floor, and she looked back at him. And neither of them said anything, but something passed between them that had not been there the day before. And both of them felt it. And both of them looked away. For a week the cars rolled, and the plant held its breath. It was dramatic irony, though nobody at Ostrander Machine Works would have called it that. The truth was already settled. The hold was unlawful, the order was airtight, the castings were moving toward Continental Tractor at last. Ruth knew it. David knew it. But the board did not yet understand what had been done to them for years, and Deemer was working every hour to make sure they never did. He tried a second time to have the filing killed, quietly, through a friend in the railroad's rate office. The tariff was airtight, and the friend backed away from it. He tried a third way, and that one was worse, because that one was aimed at Ruth herself. He went to Walter Ostrander. But before that, there were the small things, the things Ruth would remember longer than the fight, though at the time they seemed like nothing. There was the night at the siding, when David drove out to Ashby Junction to see the last of the string loaded, because he could not sit still in the office, and he found Ruth already there in her father's old coat, counting cars against a list. It had turned bitter cold. She had a thermos, a dented steel thermos that had been her father's, and without a word she unscrewed the cup and filled it and held it out to him across the coupling of a boxcar. David took it. Their gloves touched. Steam came off the coffee between them. "You come out here at night," he said. "By yourself. Somebody has to count them. Deemer won't. He's afraid of the yard now." David drank. He handed the cup back, and she drank from the same cup, and neither of them remarked on it, but both of them noticed. The way you notice a stair you've never stepped on. "My father read the official classification to me right there," Ruth said, nodding at the switch shanty. "On that bench. I was maybe 12. Other girls learned piano. I learned demurrage." She smiled at the cars. "He said the railroad was a machine like any other, and it broke down like any other, and most men were too proud to look under the hood. He said the answer was always in the book. People just didn't read past the first line." "Read past the first line," David said, as if he were memorizing it. "That's the whole thing. That's all I ever did that they couldn't." There was the drive back in the rain, another evening, when the road flooded at the low bridge, and David had to nurse the car through it in second gear, and the wipers couldn't keep up, and the two of them were sealed in together in the small lit box of the automobile with the water sheeting down the glass and the whole world gone to a blur outside. She told him about her father's last day. How Frank Kesler had walked out of the plant in 1954 with his green book under his arm and his stub pencil in his shirt pocket and had never said one bitter word at home. Not one. Only sat at the kitchen table and read the tariff at night the way another man might read the Bible, looking for the place where he could prove he'd been right. He never found the man who would listen. He died thinking they beat him, Ruth said. The rain drummed. "That's the part I can't. That's the part." David didn't reach for her. He wanted to, and he didn't, because he was still his father's son, and there was a rule in him about it, invisible and heavy as gravity. But he slowed the car, and he said her name, her first name, for the first time. Ruth. Just that. She turned and looked at him in the dashboard light. He didn't lose, David said. It took 7 years. But he didn't lose. You understand that now, don't you? You made sure of it this week. She couldn't answer. She looked back at the rain. But something in her chest that had been clenched for 7 years let go by a single degree, and she let it. And there was the overcharge. Ruth found it because she couldn't stop looking. Once she had the green book open on the plant's freight records, she went backward instead of forward, and she read 6 years of the OC&W's bills against the correct classification, car by car, month by month, and the pattern came up out of the numbers like a face out of a fog. The railroad had been billing Ostrander Machine Works at the raw commodity rate the entire time. Unfinished castings. The same error, running quietly for 6 years, on every shipment, a few dollars a car that nobody upstairs ever caught, because nobody upstairs could read the book. She added it up twice. Then she took it to David, because she had learned that week that she could. $21,400, she said, and laid the sheet on his desk. That's what they've overcharged this plant since 1955. It's owed back. There's a procedure to claim it. Reparations. It's in the tariff, too. David looked at the number for a long time. 4 salaried men in that traffic department, he said. 30 years' experience between Deemer and his clerk. And a typist found $21,000 they left on the table. My father found it first, Ruth said, in 1954. That's what I keep telling you. This isn't new. He caught this exact thing. That's why they fired him. She put her finger on the pencil note in the margin. 1954, they're wrong. He wasn't guessing. He knew. And Mr. Deemer knew he knew. David went very still. Say that again? Deemer buried it, Ruth said quietly. Think about it. If my father was right in 1954, then Deemer had been overpaying that railroad for a year already, out of his own ignorance, and a shipping clerk had caught him at it. So the clerk had to go. Troublemaker doesn't get along. They showed him the door and closed the book and kept right on paying the wrong rate for 6 more years. It was never about the railroad. It was about Deemer not being found out. The reparations claim went in under Ruth's hand, too. She signed that one without hesitating. It was getting easier. Deemer went to Walter Ostrander on a Thursday. Ruth was not in the room, but she heard the shape of it afterward, the way you hear a storm you slept through by the branches down in the yard. Deemer could not fight the tariff, so he fought the girl. He told the old man that the Kesler woman had engineered a stunt to make the front office look foolish, that she was reaching above her station, that she'd got her hooks into David. And then he reached for the oldest weapon he had, the one he'd buried in 1954, and he turned it around. He told Walter Ostrander that Frank Kesler had not been let go on principle, that Frank Kesler had been fired for fraud. And Walter Ostrander, who could not see Worth arrive in the wrong dress, who wanted the plant to survive and the family to marry right, believed the man in the good suit over the memory of a dead shipping clerk. Because it was easier. Because it fit the shape of the world he already carried. He sent for Ruth on Friday morning. She went up the stairs she had climbed 1,000 times with letters to be signed, and this time she went in alone. And Walter Ostrander was behind his big desk, with the autumn light coming hard and gray through the glass. And David was standing by the window, with his hands in his pockets and his face like a shut door. There was an envelope on the desk. Ruth knew what it was before he touched it. She had seen her father come home to a kitchen table with the same kind of quiet on it. "Miss Kesler," Walter Ostrander said, "you've done this plant a service with the freight. I'll not pretend otherwise. The cars are moving. I'm told the contract will be met." He put his hand on the envelope, but did not slide it forward yet. "But there are things about your family I've been made aware of. and there are things about your conduct with my son that this family cannot have. You understand me. A man in my position has to think of the name. What things about my family? Ruth said. I'm told your father left this plant under a cloud. Dishonesty, I'll not drag it through the mud with you standing here. I'd rather be kind. Now he moved the envelope forward. An inch. 2. There's enough here to make a fresh start somewhere else. Columbus, Cincinnati. A girl as capable as you won't want for a position. All I ask is that you take it, and that you not see David again. That's the whole of it. That's the kind way. The room was very quiet. Ruth looked at the envelope. She looked at David by the window, and she waited, and she gave him the space to speak, and David Ostrander opened his mouth, and hesitated. One beat too long. His father's rules were gravity, and he had lived inside them for 28 years, and for one terrible second the weight of them held his tongue. Ruth saw the hesitation. She would remember it. But she did not break. She did not reach for the envelope. Instead, she reached into her bag, and she took out the green book. And beneath it a single folded sheet gone soft and yellow at the creases, and she laid the sheet on the desk beside the money, face up, so the old man could read it. Before I go, she said, and her voice did not shake at all now, you should read the whole thing, Mr. Ostrander, not just the first line. My father always said that was where men like you stopped. Walter Ostrander looked down. It was a memo. Interoffice, Ostrander Machine Works, dated the spring of 1954, typed on a machine whose crooked lowercase Ruth would have known anywhere, because she had that same machine's daughter's hands. It was addressed to the traffic manager, R. Deemer, it laid out, in a shipping clerk's plain, careful words, that the OC&W was billing the plant's finished castings under the wrong classification item, that the correct item carried a lower rate and no lien, that the railroad had been overcharging the works for more than a year, and that, unless corrected, the error would cost the company thousands and expose it to a bad order hold on any future shipment the railroad cared to squeeze. It was signed Frank Kesler, and across the bottom, in a different hand, in traffic manager's ink, someone had written, "Not your concern. Do not raise this again." He raised it again, Ruth said. Twice more. I found the copies in his things. The third time, they let him go. Mr. Deemer told you my father was a thief. My father was the only honest man that railroad ever dealt with in this county, and it cost him 19 years and his good name, and, I think, in the end, it cost him his life. He caught the exact error I caught, 7 years ago. And your Mr. Deemer buried it. And let this plant bleed 6 years of overcharges, $21,400 of them, rather than admit a shipping clerk read the book better than he did. She straightened. You can keep your envelope. I never took a thing I didn't earn, and neither did my father. Good morning. And she picked up the green book. She left the memo lying there on the desk, in the light, and she turned, and walked out with her back straight and her eyes dry, the same way she had walked out of the executive's office weeks before with a coffee tray in her hands. She had done it with dignity then, and she did it with dignity now. Behind her, Walter Ostrander sat looking at his dead shipping clerk's signature, and at the word thief he had believed without checking, and something in the old man's certainty cracked straight down the middle. And David finally moved. Too late to stop her going, but he moved. He crossed the office, and he picked up the memo, and he read it, and then he set it back down, and he looked at his father, and he said, "You were about to pay her to disappear." On Deemer's word. You never once read the book either. His voice was low, and it was the first fully grown thing his father had ever heard him say. I'm done guessing, Dad. I'm done letting men in good suits guess for us. She reads. We're going to let her read. The last cars reached Continental Tractor with a day to spare. Ruth got the wire herself at her own desk, and she read it twice, and then she folded it and put it in her bag next to the green book and went on typing, because the work was still the work. 600 jobs held. The quarter saved. $312,000 of finished castings delivered and accepted, and the contract clause never triggered, with a single day standing between the plant and ruin. 9 days on the clock, and it had come down to the last one, and it had held. The reparations check came 3 weeks after that. $21,400 from the OC&W, paid on a claim signed by a plant typist. David laid the actual check on the conference table in front of the board so they could see it was real, so no one could turn it into a story. Iron proof. Money you could hold. And then he called the meeting. He called it into the big office with the glass, the boardroom where the 8 executives sat. The same 8 who had watched Royce Deemer send a typist for coffee and tell her to let the men who understood freight handle it. And this time, David sent word down to the shipping floor and the machine floor, too. And the foremen came up in their work clothes and stood along the wall, men who had known Frank Kesler, men who had eaten sandwiches beside him for 19 years. Old Culp was among them, the shop foreman, gray as iron, who had been Frank's friend. Ruth did not know what was coming. David had only said, "Bring the book." She came in with the green tariff book against her chest, and she stood at the foot of the long table where the light was. And David stood at the head of it, where his father usually sat, and Walter Ostrander himself was there, off to the side now, watching, saying nothing. "Gentlemen," David said, "for 9 days this fall, the whole quarter of this company sat frozen on a rail siding at Ashby Junction. 40 cars. $312,000, 600 paychecks. The railroad said it had a lien. Our traffic department, 30 years of experience in it, spent 3 days telling us there was nothing to be done but pay and beg." He put his hands flat on the table. There was something to be done. It was in a book. And the only person in this county who could read that book was standing in the back of the room with a coffee tray, and a man who is not here today told her to go pour it. Nobody moved. "Miss Kesler," David said, "read it to them, the way you read it to me. Line by line, show these men what 4 salaried men couldn't solve." And Ruth Kesler set the green book down on the polished table, in the morning light, in front of the 8 men who had judged her, and she opened it to the page with her father's pencil note in the margin, and she began to read. She read them the first item, the one everybody stopped at, the raw commodity rate with the lien attached. Then she read them the second. And then, turning the page, she read them the third item, the one that governed finished machined castings, the one that carried no lien at all, the one no traffic man at Ostrander Machine Works had bothered to read in 30 years. She showed them the rate. She showed them the lien language and how it did not reach. She walked them through the reconsignment procedure the way you'd walk a child across a street, plain, patient. No triumph in it, only the truth laid out in order until there was no room left in the room to argue with it. When she finished there was a silence you could have set a cup down on. Then Ruth closed the book, and she looked up, and she said the one thing she had carried in her chest for 7 years. "You paid college men to guess for 9 days, she said. My father read you the answer in 1954. And you thanked him with a pink slip. Along the wall, the foreman did not stay quiet. It was Culp who spoke first, the old shop foreman, and his voice was rough. "Frank Kesler was the straightest man ever worked in this plant," he said, to the whole board, to Walter Ostrander in his chair. "We all knew it. We all knew what was done to him, and we all kept our heads down because we had families. That's on us." He looked at Ruth and his hard old face moved. Frank'd have liked to see this. By God, he'd have liked to see this. And around him the other foremen, her father's friends, the men who had eaten beside Frank Kesler for 19 years, made a low sound of agreement that ran along the wall like a current, and it was the sound of a thing being set right at last, out loud, in front of everybody. Royce Deemer was not in the room. He had been asked to be, and he had not come, and everyone understood what that meant. His chair at the table sat empty while Ruth turned the pages, and before she was finished the empty chair had said everything. David read it into the record anyway, so there could be no mistaking it and no undoing it later. The buried 1954 memo. Not your concern. Do not raise this again. 6 years of overcharges the man had let run rather than admit a clerk had caught him. The disgrace of an honest employee to cover the incompetence of a manager. It was read out plainly to the board. Every line of it. No shouting, no violence. Just the facts laid down one after another like ties under a rail. And when it was done, Royce Deemer was finished at Ostrander Machine Works. Quietly, lawfully, through the very same door he had once used on Frank Kesler. He cleaned out his office that afternoon while the plant ran on around him, and hardly a soul looked up, and that was the whole of his fall. And it was enough. Then Walter Ostrander stood up. The old man came around the table slowly, and the room did not know what he would do, and Ruth did not either. She stood her ground the way she always had. He stopped in front of her, and he looked at the green book on the table, and he looked at her plain, steady face, and for a long moment the class rules he had worn all his life like a good coat hung off him and did not fit any more. "Miss Kesler," he said, "I had an envelope on my desk with your name near it 3 weeks ago. I want to say that in front of these men, because they should know what kind of fool an old man can be when he trusts the wrong voice and won't read the page himself." He drew a breath. It cost him. "I judged your father on another man's word and never once opened the book. I judged you on your dress and your desk. I was wrong on both counts. And the proof of it just walked this board through 9 days of freight law that my whole traffic department slept through." He turned to David and then back to Ruth. "There's a position in this company," he said, "for freight and traffic. It's open. It has been for about 3 weeks, though I didn't know it till today." The faintest dry thing crossed the old man's mouth. "I'll not insult you with an envelope. I'm offering you the desk. Your name on the door. If you'll have us." Ruth Kesler stood very still. 4 years she had refused to put her name on anything. She had signed it once, in the cold at Ashby Junction, and the sky had not fallen. Now they were asking to put it on a door. "I'll have the desk," she said, "on one condition. That the reference book on it stays my father's. His name gets said in this building again, out loud, when the freight goes right. That's my condition." "Done," said Walter Ostrander. Done, Claire Vanderveer was not there for any of it, and that was its own kind of answer. When the story went round the county, banker's daughter and all, and it became clear which way the wind at the Ostrander works had turned, Claire withdrew from the understanding that had never quite been a promise, and she did it coldly, in a note, and the chill in the note told everyone what the warmth had always been hiding. Duty had made the match. Duty lost. Nobody grieved it long. David found Ruth on the depot stairs at dusk, the day the new desk was carried up. The sky over Ashby Junction had gone to honey and ash, the long autumn light coming level across the cinder yard and the strings of cars. Ruth was sitting on the depot steps with the green book on her knees, and David came and sat down beside her. Close. No rule between them now, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the couplers banged somewhere far down the line. "I hesitated," David said finally, "in my father's office, when he put the envelope out. I want to say it before I say anything else, because you saw it, and you should know I know." He looked at his hands. "I was raised to think the answer comes down from the top. from the men with the degrees, in the good suits. I stood there my whole life believing that. And a typist read me 3 lines out of a book her father taught her at a switch shanty, and it saved everything the degrees couldn't. I stopped guessing the day I let you read to me, Ruth. He turned and looked at her. I don't want to guess any more. Stay, not the desk. You, stay. Ruth looked at the owner's son in the last of the light. The service door girl, the clerk's daughter, being asked plainly to sit at the head of the table with him, in front of a town that had watched her carry coffee. I never wanted to be at the top, she said. I only ever wanted to be listened to once. On merit. You were, David said. You will be. Every day I've got, and on the depot stairs at Ashby Junction, with the freight moving right for the first time in 7 years, and her father's name spoken again inside the plant, Ruth Kesler let the owner's son take her hand, and this time neither of them looked away. It was spring, when the last of it settled into something like peace. 6 months on, the siding at Ashby Junction ran clean and classed right, and the cars loaded in the soft green morning without a red tag among them. There was a desk up in the front office now, and on the door a small brass plate that read R. Kesler, Freight and Traffic, and on the desk itself, worn and green and holy, sat the book. David had set it there himself, that first day, and laid a card beside it in his own hand. Read past the first line. D. Ruth signed the manifests in her own hand every morning, the name coming easy now, no fear left in it at all. Down at the switch, Sam Bly waved to her when her bus came in, and she waved back, and if there was a small sadness in Sam, it was a settled one. He had loved her true and lost her clean, and he had helped her win the whole thing on the one dawn that mattered. And a man could carry that and still be at peace. He tipped his cap to her every morning, and every morning she raised her hand. On a porch that evening, with the spring dark coming warm and the frogs going down in the low ground, there was a thermos of coffee for 2, her father's dented steel thermos, and Ruth poured for David the way she had poured for him across a coupling in the cold. And they went over the next quarter's tariffs together with the book open between them, heads bent, the lamplight on the pages. Walter Ostrander sat in a rocker at the far end of the porch and watched his son and the clerk's daughter argue happily over a freight rate. And he said, to no one, to the dark, to the memory of a shipping clerk he had once shown the door. The only thing there was left to say. I judged the dress, the old man said quietly. He read the ledger. The frogs answered. Down at the junction a train went through toward morning, the couplers banging one after another down the line, the way they always had, the way they always would, only now there was a name signed at the bottom of the page, in a clear, steady hand, and it was the right one. And it was hers. If you've ever held the one answer nobody in the room would let you speak, tell me the town you're watching from tonight.